An online KBHC experience, Fundamentals Deep Dive with Bernhard Scully, an offering of Cormont music and our gift to the horn community. In this session, we feature Bernhard Scully, horn soloist, former member of Canadian Brass, artistic director of Kendall Betts Horn Camp, and associate professor of horn at the University of Illinois. I'm your moderator, John Wonderland, principal horn with the Beloit Janesville Symphony, fourth horn with La Crosse Symphony, and member of the board of directors of Cormont Music. Before we jump into the session, a few housekeeping items. So that we may be able to hear the presentation, we've muted all participants. Please stay muted for the duration of the session unless one of our presenters asks you to unmute. If you click on participants at the bottom of the screen, you should see a participant list pop up with your name at the top. If the name associated with your Zoom account is different from your own first and last name, please click on the blue More button next to your name, select Rename, and enter your first and last name. This will help us know who you are and who it is we are communicating with. If you click on chat at the bottom of the screen, you should see the chat box appear. Comments posted in the chat are affected by the drop-down menu above the text box. Depending on your selection, your comments may be viewed by everyone or by an individual participants. Each time you enter a comment into the chat, please double check your selection so that your comment is seen by your intended audience. And with that, I'll hand the session off to Bernhard.
Thank you so much, John. It's always good to see your face and hear your voice. Almost feels like we're in New Hampshire. Not really. Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure and honor to be presenting to you today. This class today, Horn Fundamentals Deep Dive, I should preface it by saying it's really only going to be a very narrow part of what fundamentals are and could be. Fundamentals can be, cover a very wide range of things, and you've already seen many of those things today, starting with our fundamentals routine in the morning. And then Jeff Agrell had some wonderful things to say, and everyone else has touched on these issues. What we're going to be talking about today is really four aspects of what I would classify as fundamental skills that deal with musical and technical control of the instrument. And when we talk about technique on the instrument, and also with music as well, sometimes you think of flashy things, or how fast can you play your scales, how high can you play, how loud can you play, all that kind of stuff. Those are all great, but really what to me technique means is control. So even though you can't play, maybe I can't play that high, I can't play that loud, but I try to maximize myself to gain control of all that I'm able to do. So the exercises and kind of the thinking I'm presenting to you today is kind of along that line, and it kind of builds on what we've done. If you were with us this morning for the standardized routine and all week, what that deals with is really, basic things like breathing, obviously like tension in the body, establishing your best sound, and then beginning to work this sound all over the range. And so it's in large part that routine deals with range building, sound building, flexibility, basic articulation, and then plus a couple other things like the lip trilling and all the rest. Here we're going to be kind of going a little bit further and expanding more on the sound. Also, we're going to be dealing right away with phrasing. So I really think that needs to be put front and center, the sound and phrasing with what you think of as a fundamental in playing, because it really connects. Fundamentals are things to me that if you master something, it would connect into pretty much anything that you do on the instrument, whether you're playing a Mozart concerto, whether you're playing a jazz solo, whether you're playing low horn, high horn. A fundamental would be something that would have a relation and sort of be a foundational element to all those things. So I feel like these things we're presenting today, although they don't encapsulate all fundamentals, kind of hit it head on. And also, it's really what the camp, the way I'm presenting it today is it's a little different for those of you that are familiar with what the camp has done in the past, especially when Kendall was in charge of it. It's very similar to that, but I've kind of broken it down a bit more. For me, I found, for instance, like diving right into the copperage etudes, which are fantastic, and everybody should work on those. Um, it's a lot for a lot of people to just dive into it. It's putting a lot of things together. It requires a lot of subsets of skills. So what I'm doing here is trying to break down those skills and then build them up very modestly. You notice the range today is only going to go about a fifth. That's okay. And then once you gain some control of that, then hopefully you can take it into your copperage etudes and hopefully even beyond. So, anyways, that's just some little information, background on why I'm doing this. Again, so it's been part of the camp culture for many years. I mean, the one thing about camp is it's designed to make you better. Our goal, our job as teachers at the Horn Camp is to make you guys as good as you possibly can be. And although fundamentals can be taught in many different ways, I have found that this particular way, which is not the end all, is very effective. And it's also very understandable by many people, or by maybe most people, I'd wager to say. So if you don't like it, you can toss it out. If it's too boring, you can leave the session. But I really would stake my life on the fact that if you spend some time with this kind of material, it's really going to improve you and going to take you to a higher level. And you can feel free to ask questions if you want along the way. I'm hoping to get through the material well under the hour. That's my hope. Maybe not. I hope, for those of you that know me, I probably won't do that. But my hope is that, and then we can do some questions. So we're going to go back to this morning when we established our first sound of the day. It's really important that that is kind of the foundational element. I mean, sound is pretty much our product on the instrument, along with our musicality. So sound and phrasing. And so you wouldn't want to kind of dive into this stuff unless you were really comfortable with the quality of your sound. And you all have your own best unique sounds. I tell my students that, like, I don't have the best sound in the world, but I've worked on it. I have a pretty good sound. I certainly don't tell my students they have to sound like me or anything, but I want all my students to sound like the best they can sound. And that's really cool. It's very much like voices. It'd be very strange if all of us had like the exact same singing voice. We would have to wonder if we were like in the Matrix or something. We don't. We all have very unique singing voices, and they can be developed into our own unique voices. It's one of the really great things about being a human being. And I think that's one of the really, really great things about playing the horn is that, you yourself have your own best sound. So we're going to spend a little bit of time once again establishing that before we begin to expand on it. So we're going to stay as relaxed as we can. We're only going to use as much tension, as Jesse was saying this morning, as we have to. I remember Barry Tuckwell once saying, so much of our practice is really dealing with what muscles we shouldn't be using. Kind of weeding out the tension, only finding out the muscles we should be using. That's kind of what we're doing with our sound exercise. So it's going to be predicated by a full capacity breath. Breathing is definitely a fundamental, although we've already dealt with that this morning, and I'm sure others have dealt with it as well. So we're not going to spend, just assuming you guys have taken some full capacity breaths. We're going to be setting the mouthpiece on a fairly relaxed embouchure, kind of like when you're sleeping, sleeping face, no tension. And then we begin to add the tension that we need to make the sound. You might try it with a breath attack, and a syllable you can use. Kendall had us always doing ah-oo, if you say ah-oo, or who, or for people who speak Romance languages, which I don't, you can use the French don. That was the old hand horn syllable, don, D-O-N. French. All of those syllables get us the jaw slightly lowered, sort of relaxed sensation in the face, a little more open. So here we go. So it's going to kind of establish the first best sound. You guys can feel free to try this with me. All this stuff is for you guys to try. So please take your horns out and play it with me. And choose whatever note you like. The open notes on the horn are all very nice. I'm probably going to choose an E or a G. So just kind of experiment. I'll try a G now. try the C as well. C is a little more lackluster for me, so I tend not to focus on it right away. Whatever sound, whatever note you feel like you can get that humming quality, no grit in the sound. We're really going for this pure, um, balanced sound. One thing I should say about, the harmonic series, when we play on it, all the notes on the instrument, they're almost like shelves. And so on a shelf, there's all this space. We don't think of it that way, but there is. A lot of folks, they'll play sort of on the upper part of the shelf, sort of the upper part. It's kind of common, but you don't, with the upper part, you have a lot of high overtones, but you negate a lot of the lower overtones. Occasionally, some people might play maybe lower on the shelf, It's kind of flat and dull. I mean, both of those things are probably not ultimately desirable for most of the music we play in Western culture, at least. So we're going to try to shoot for something more in the center, maybe just slightly south of center. Might be that moment where we get the maximal vibration. So if you think of it that visual way, that kind of helps me. So kind of getting a nice balance of upper and lower overtones. Core. Sometimes the word is core for the sound. So we're really spending a lot of time. This is one of the very most important fundamentals, that you spend time with your sound and you feel very comfortable and you enjoy it. Or Miles Davis is one who said, when you finally are comfortable with or know how you want to sound and are able to sound that way, that's when you start getting real good. So I like that. I always like that quote. Okay. Then we're going to go on to the traditional long tone study. Again, you can pick your note, and I'll put the metronome on. It's nice to have a tuner on, or maybe a drone when you do this, just to kind of get a pitch reference. You don't have to be, a slave to the tuner necessarily, but it does kind of show us, what our tendencies are. The G might be a little bit higher, the E might be a little bit lower. And now what we're going to do is we're going to expand that sound. We're going to start with our really, really best sound. Might still do the air attack, and we're going to take it as soft as we can to as loud as we can without distorting the sound. So at first this might feel really uncomfortable because maybe you're not used to pushing your dynamics this way, which is totally fine. Just have at it, experiment, and then you do it a couple times and you start to realize like kind of what you're capable of. When the tone begins to get too loud, it sounds that kind of the pitch begins to get way out and all of that kind of a white noise quality. Once you reach that point, you've probably reached your limit for the day. But the goal over time is to keep pushing these boundaries, keep containing your most beautiful sound in the softest and the loudest dynamics. So I'll do one of these long tones for you. It's basically going to be 6 up, 6 down. I'll start with an air attack. And I'll try to just, the main thing is trying to keep the sound as beautiful as I can the whole time. It's quite a challenging exercise. Have you ever done it? Sure. You want to hold the last note just a little bit longer to get that extra niente kind of quality. That was pretty good. I kind of wavered a little bit in the center. I might want to do it again. Okay, let's do one more of those. I'll do it on an E. So you got to take your full capacity breath with this big time. You probably realize that. So let's do it again. 1, 2. It felt okay. Well, let's try the last one. Let's try the C. Just to try it. 1, 2. Okay, hopefully that felt all right. If the 12 count is too much for you, you can always do, say, 8 counts, or 4 counts up, 4 counts down, or 3 counts up, 3 counts down. I think the most important thing, just like in the morning session, is you start at a point that you feel comfortable with. You don't want to start at a point that's beyond your capability. That's really important because as we do this more and more, we keep building upon the skills. And so if you sort of skip over some of them, that I've seen a lot of frustration from players. They do this for a while, they haven't really got it, or it's maybe too much for them. And then all of a sudden they just kind of dive into the Coprush, or they dive into some excerpts, and it's they've skipped that important step that's going to have a profound effect on later kinds of playing. So really spend the time you need to gain control. And ultimately, you want to be playing these long tones on notes all over the course of your range. And you can even invert the dynamics. You can start fortissimo and come back down to pianissimo. You can do it only pianissimo, only fortissimo. The point is to begin to expand your beautiful sound into these outer regions. That's the other aspect to this presentation, is kind of the confidence we can gain when we start to explore our extremes. So you might feel like, well, Bernhard, that's very loud. That's really soft. I never play that soft or loud. It's like, well, maybe not yet. But the point is, unless you understand just how soft you can play with control and just how loud you can play with control, you don't really have a proper perspective yet on your abilities. And it can catch you off guard in an ensemble, for instance, when all of a sudden the conductor is saying louder, louder. You think you're playing as loud as you can, but now you got to play louder or softer, especially, right? Anybody ever got that? The hand. So it's really important in your practice. Like sometimes for soft playing, for instance, I will just attack a soft note and then come down as far as I possibly can, just right before the note kind of falls off, and I'll try to hold it right there. So kind of like this. Maybe hold it for 20 seconds or something. It's really uncomfortable. It's like, I feel like you're just barely holding on. But the more you do it, the more it becomes a common skill. And the same thing with the loud dynamic. Sometimes I'll just kind of hold on to long notes, loud notes. That wasn't very loud. It's just kind of gain control of that, because that's what you have to do in Tchaikovsky or Mahler. That really caught me off guard as a young player. I'd never really played loud, to that kind of level. And all of a sudden I had to do it all the time in the orchestra. So when I actually started to practice it systematically in my practice, it became much easier. Okay, so that's kind of what that is. And I just encourage you to do it on as many notes as you can in a given day, maybe later in the day. A good time for this kind of practice maybe is after you've done a lot of your other stuff, after you've warmed up and practiced your music. Do this near the end, so you don't tire yourself out earlier in the day. That's, for me, that kind of works better. Okay, so the next one is something you may or may not have been thinking about, but it's just for phrasing, this concept of note grouping, which is, again, not the end all with phrasing. Phrasing is a fairly subjective term, but it's one of the really basic fundamental tools I have found to be beneficial to me. Kendall fortunately taught me it when I was pretty young, actually. And I think it's something which applies to almost all music. I've only indicated just very briefly, like a very brief concept with this, because this is something that can become quite subjective, and you can really take it down a rabbit hole. And I'm not an expert in Tabato's numbering system or anything like that, but I do find a very basic understanding of it can lend itself, can give us, really empower us, and we can kind of apply it in all different ways that seem appropriate to us. So that's what I would say. So once you kind of learn the basic principle of what this is, you can go to music yourself. That's kind of the idea, is then you with your creative mind can begin to apply this tool to your Beethoven and to whatever you're playing. So kind of the idea of note grouping, a great book, by the way, Sound in Motion by David McGill, the former principal bassoonist of the Chicago Symphony, I believe. Wonderful book if you can read it. It's probably is the best um, layout of what this is and how we can apply it. Um, it deals with the motion of music. So now we have musical analysis. We talk about chords. We talk about rhythms. We talk about all of that stuff. We have solfege to name the notes. But there's also this language which begins to talk about the function of the note. Like, what is the function of the first note of this phrase, or what does this note doing in terms of the motion of it? Is it going more forward? Is it coming more back? Violin or string players have wonderful notation for this. They have like down and up bows. I didn't put that in there because it's a little bit confusing, but you have a down and up, and this oftentimes ties directly to phrasing. It's a very kind of a visceral way of thinking of it. For us, it's a little more abstract because we're not, we can't see our airstream, and airstream is always moving forward in some ways. So we kind of have to do a lot of this conceptually. So I think this for me has been one of the more effective conceptual tools. And you want to introduce it early on. So basically, a common way of thinking of this would be in a grouping of four. Boom, I'll turn the metronome on here. So we have this. So you think 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. I have in parentheses kind of the common notion, like the one beat gets the strong beat, and all the other beats are kind of just there. That may seem like a reasonable solution to thinking about the motion of music, but it's not really the way music functions. Like if we sang that way, I don't know, like this morning I was doing the lullaby. Lullaby, lullaby, da 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 dun dun da dum. It's not very musically interesting, even though that's what the metronome or that's what the music might seem to indicate. Rather, what happens in a grouping like this is we have the energy begins to pick up the second note. So we have another one. It's almost like 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. That creates this motion in the phrase. The same thing with the lullaby. Do do dee, do do dee, ya da dee, da 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 dum. It's a really big difference, if you compare the two ways I sang it. So this is just a really basic way. You could change it to 3, 4 different, meters if you wanted. But to keep it really simple, I just have a 4/4 meter for you. So I hope that might be maybe one of the more confusing aspects of what I'm talking about today, because it's a little abstract. But again, hopefully you can see what I'm talking about. So the way that you might think music is played would be or even sometimes like accents on 1 and 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. I would argue no, we would not want to do that. We want to do something else. We want to put the emphasis on the second beat, which now becomes the leading note in the phrase. Might seem a little subtle, but I think it's a big difference between the two. One has motion, one did not. One has life and breath, and one did not. So right away, this is something which I believe is very fundamental. Now it's very subjective in the way we have to apply it, but if we can begin to think like this, like music as vocal inflection rather than simply systematic notation, it's a way for us to connect, emotionally to a degree with the music and the meaning behind the music. So again, it's a little bit much, and that's a very brief introduction, but hopefully you'll see now how we're going to begin to put these things together and how that applies to the next few. Sorry, the next phrase we're going to do is this one after it, bar 7 here. I'll apply the same concept here. So mm. As opposed to more of the mundane. That's the over accentuation of the 1 and the 3. So I'll go once again. I'll do the 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. Putting energy on that second beat right away because it's leading to the next downbeat. Helps in many ways. It's an immediate solution to smoothness and to connectivity as well, because now all these notes have a specific direction you can think of it. So if you really want to do a deep dive with that, you can read the biography of Tabito, who was the oboist of the Philadelphia Orchestra for many years, or just, I would say, David McGill's book is probably one of the better solutions. Okay, so now we're moving on to adding the dynamics on top of this phrase. And what we're going to focus on now is the first half of that long tone. And a long tone sort of is a very extreme form of a phrase. You know, the 6 up and the 6 down, we're adding all this energy. And even though we're diminuendoing with that phrase, we're still keeping the phrasing energy. So now to keep it more simple, we're just going to do the first half of the phrase. So we have the note grouping, we have the dynamics. Let's see if we can do this. So I'll do one iteration here. I'm going to try to really think about making it as even as I possibly can. There are 8 beats, quarter beats total here. I want to make each one of these beats incrementally more from pianissimo to forte. See if I can do it. It's pretty good. Still, it's always hard. You haven't noticed, like, this stuff is some of the hardest stuff we do, even though it seems so simple. So, you know, that could have been probably more even. And I probably could have put a little more thought into it. So one of the ways we can begin to focus on even more evenness and even more connectivity with this phrase and dynamic evenness is to subdivide. So you can think about each one of these notes in terms of eighth notes, the one subdivision removed from what we have. So I'll do it that way. I'll play it, and then I'll also actually subdivide it to. All right. That helped me. So now I'm going to play it as is again. I'm going to think more like that. Okay? 2. Okay. I wager to say that was much better. I don't want to be, you know, say it for sure because I'm the one playing, but hopefully you could hear a difference with that. And the other way we can gain more awareness of this in our extremes is to just simply play the first note as soft as we can and play the last note as loud as we can. I find with a lot of younger students and people who have a little less experience, what they struggle with at first is once they get going, they never quite reach their extremes because it's such a difficult exercise. And so this is one way to just establish that right off the bat, you know, kind of the endpoints of what our goal is. So that's pretty soft. Like, I might be a little softer. There we go. Yeah. And then loud. It's probably the loudest I can do today. So then, okay, now my brain's informed. Like, that was that's softer and that's how loud. So now I have these much clearer goalposts that I've set for myself. I'll go back and now using the same subdivision and my awareness of my extremes to go into the our bar 17 here, see if this helps. I don't know if it will, but at least I think it will. Here we go. Okay. try it one more time. 1, 2. That felt pretty good. Okay, so that seems like a lot of like, Bernhard, you are hyper focusing on this too much, but trust me, no, it's not. I mean, we've just begun to scratch the surface with this stuff. We're trying to establish the highest standards we can for these kind of things. And unless we do this for ourselves, we'll never really gain the awareness that we need. So trust me, it's worth it. Now, moving on from that, the other fundamental I wanted to focus on today is just articulation. Now, with the warm up, oftentimes we say, just choose your articulation just to get some tonguing going for the warm up, just to get that mechanism moving. But I think we really want to refine the articulation in our practice eventually. So we, again, have this awareness of what is our most sustained articulation, legato or molto legatissimo, if you will. How, that one step away from slurring, well, like, what is that? What does it feel like? The other, on the flip side, is what is the most separated articulation we can play? Staccato or molto staccatissimo, that kind of thing. We can play with control, with tonal integrity. And again, most people don't really spend the time to address these extremes, just similar to the dynamics, for instance. So you might find yourself in a situation in the orchestra where the conductor is saying, horns shorter, shorter, and you're like, I'm playing as short as I can, but we have to be able to play much, much shorter. And it's not to say that we will play this way even very often, maybe only rarely, but we have to know that we can do it. We have to establish that extreme to better understand ourselves as players. So the first thing we're going to do is focus on the legato, which again is one step away from slurring. It's as connected as possible. And I give you this first just series of half notes, then quarters. I'll turn the metronome back on. We're going to be focusing on a do or a do articulation. Now, with articulation placement, this is where it gets tricky because we're all different. All of your mouths and tongues and inner oral cavities and all of these things are different than mine. We're all unique. So your tongue placement is likely going to be slightly different and maybe even a lot different than mine. So I offer this do or do as a general starting point. And then we have to do a lot of experimentation to understand what works for us. And then once we find out what works, we kind of stick with it. So that's maybe the bad news is if you're hoping for me to give you all the answers, I can't, because I just can't see inside your mouth. And but with my students, for instance, we oftentimes work over long periods of time to figure out what works the best for them. And I'm always surprised at things that it's not necessarily what I do. So try to start with the do or the do. One of the things to really think about with articulation is that even with the legato, especially with the legato, the tongue has to move quite fast. The tongue cannot move slow. You can't go do, do. It still has to go do, do, and get out of the way to make that connectivity. So when you're playing very slow music, that's a trapping sometimes. Like, oh, things are very slow or things are very soft. So the tongue will just move slow. And that's a surefire way to lose all your control right there. So we're going to establish it differently. So I'll try it and see if I can demonstrate this here. That felt pretty good. So the idea is almost like the sound's bleeding from one note to the next. Why don't you guys try it on your own? And you can also think of this whole thing just simply as a long tone. Like before we did that long tone. And all we're doing now is we're going to break it up. We're going to parse it up with our tongue in the legato style. Let's try it once again, thinking like that. So we want that continuous airflow or support. Sometimes, Kendall used to always say support. I think for myself, sometimes airflow makes a little more sense, which means support, because airflow is something that I can visualize. I can visualize the air moving into my mouthpiece, into my horn, and you can even think of it as a color. I have one student who likes to imagine things in colors, and so if you want to imagine that airstream as a red stream or a orange stream or whatever kind of color strikes you, um, just that visual, because that has to be with articulation. Airflow or support is really what it's predicated on. If you don't have the support, you're not going to be able to articulate. It's all predicated on that. The tongue does very little work, actually. That's one of the myths, is that the tongue does all this work, and do the tongue like this. Well, the tongue's not going to help at all unless that air is moving and supporting the sound. The airflow is just right there. So let's try it once again. 2. There. All right, so hopefully that feels a little bit better. So now we're going to go back to our little phrase we kind of created before, our proto-music phrase, if you will. That's the way I think of Koprash, by the way. I mean, it's not music. It's just like proto-music. It's something which is leading into, it's almost music, So this is maybe even more proto than Koprash. We'll get in there. Okay, so we're going to try to do this. I might slur it first, once again, just to kind of get the sensation of that. Here we go. Okay, so the air is continuous, and I'm just going to add that tongue to, and I'm thinking of the note grouping, so I don't want to let the energy die away on the second beat. Don't want to go, oh, I want to think, right? Felt pretty good. You guys can try it just for a minute. And then we're going to move on. We're going to add, again, the next layer is the dynamic. So we're kind of adding these layers. We establish the sound, we get the dynamics going, and we get our phrasing going, and then we begin to change the notes just a bit. Then we get our articulation going, and then finally we add the dynamics back into place, and we're putting a lot of things on top. This is not easy stuff. Let's try with the dynamics here. So, all right, let's do it slurred once together. 1, 2, right. Good. Now we're just going to do that legato tongue. So even though it's getting very loud, we're going to keep it molto legatissimo. 1, 2, right. A little more challenging, kind of put all those things together and not fall into either unevenness for the dynamics or the phrasing, or getting into unevenness with the articulation. One of the things we're building with this is consistency, this notion of consistency. And again, not to say we should always articulate like this, or all music deals with this. Surely doesn't. But this is really establishing, I would just say, a very powerful tool in sort of reference point for us as players to deal with these skills in these kind of a benchmark. It's worked for me. I hope you guys understand what that is. So, all right, that's enough on the legato tonguing. Now we're just going to spend the last bit of time here on the flip side doing the staccato tonguing. Now we're going to change it. Staccato means separation, by the way. It doesn't mean extra. It doesn't even necessarily mean short. So in string terminology, it just means separating the notes. Molto staccato as playing, or molto staccatissimo even, playing as short as possible, almost like pizzicatos or something on the string. So we really want to get to the point where we can play as short as we possibly can and gain some control with that. So the first part of this is getting us to explore playing shorter and shorter, or more and more separated with shorter lengths of notes. That's kind of what the note duration is going to be diminishing. And we should do this. I didn't write this down, but this is also very useful to do with the air attack. And the reason we do that is just to show us how much we can do with the air alone, how much the tongue is not even necessary for much of this, or how much we can easily overuse it. So it's a kind of another way of building efficiency. So we're going to change the syllable to two. You might even consider like more of legato in the first couple bars here. But what we're doing is we're halving the notes. We're being very meticulous. I'll sing it. Two, 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 off, two, off, two, off, 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 two, off, 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 two, so being very meticulous, we're actually controlling the length of the notes very consciously. It's not just we're playing short. We want to know just how short we're playing. Maybe some of you can even do like 64th notes. I don't know. I can't tell the difference between 32nd and 64th notes sometimes, but if you can, good. We also want to be very careful we don't cut off the end of the note abruptly or unmusically. I feel like in many ways we should be careful, at least in most instances, to not do things we wouldn't sing. So if you're singing short notes, dum bum bum bum, you wouldn't go dun, da, da, you wouldn't revert to that kind of singing that we might do we could easily do on the horn. We could easily kind of destroy the ends of the notes. So we're going to be really working for a beautiful end of the note, even in the very short notes we're playing. Let's try it. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Hopefully we're able to achieve the differences as you shorten those durations of the notes. So when you add a dot over a note, creating a staccato, what it really means is that you cut the note in half, or maybe even only use a fourth of it, depending on the nature of the music. That's what it means. And you can think that way. It gives a little more control of it. Let's now do it more consecutively. The next line, 35 here. 2, 2, right. Good. Let's go back and do that one again with just the air and see if you can keep the integrity of the length of the notes and the sound of the notes and even the beginnings of the notes. Let's see what you can see how it feels. Just air. 1, 2, 3. Those last 30-second notes become very challenging, but the 16th notes, I feel like I could achieve those pretty well, which just makes you realize, wow, the air can do a lot. So the tongue, really what the tongue does is it takes all that work the air is doing and it just clarifies it. It just adds that extra bit of definition. And really, that's what articulation really means. Articulation in speaking means clarity. It does not mean over consonants. I mean, if I speak over consonants, you would think I was crazy. You did not know English, or did not, grow up in this culture or something. We don't speak that way. We speak actually mostly with our vocal enunciation. So when playing, it's the same. We don't want to over enunciate with the consonants. Consonants is there just to kind of add the icing on the cake for us, to create that extra bit of clarity. Let's go back and do that once again with the tongue now. And focus on the ends of the notes, beautiful ends. What we want to avoid, by the way, is this. That kind of at the end of the note. We don't want that. Very rarely would we want that, only if it's indicated by the composer. Really, sometimes you come across that, but mostly you want that ending of the note to be very beautiful, even if it's very short. That's one of the reasons you want to think of it mostly in terms of note duration and not like a cutoff. So, okay, here we go again with the tongue. 2, ready? Good. All right, now we're going to do even more consecutive. We're going to do these 3 bars of consecutive da, 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 rest, dit, 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 rest, and then shortest. Dit, 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 dit. Okay, let's try. 1, 2, ready? Rest. Good. So you really have to be you have to support this very much. It's like the air just has to be ready to go as you reattack these notes. If the air has to kind of start up again, so that full capacity breath is very, very important. Your air is really energized. You need to be thinking about the phrasing. So mostly with short playing, the air is kind of it was always the most important thing, but without it, you really cannot achieve the shortness or the separation you want, no matter what you do with your tone. So, all right, so now let's try this with just a mezzo piano dynamic in this little scalar passage, which may or may not be leading us into number 3 co-brush. I don't know about that, but maybe. Here, I'll do it for you. I'm going to just be trying to play these notes as short as I can. I'll go through a process. I'll go through a slur. I'll go through a legato, and then I'm going to go through add my molto staccato, just to kind of get that connection with the air flow and support. 2. Now legato. Now staccato. Let's everybody try that. Slur, legato, molto staccato. Ready? 1, 2, ready? Legato. Staccato. Good. Now lastly, we're just going to add our dynamics. We're just going to add a pianissimo to fortissimo crescendo over 1 bar. So each one of these 8 notes is going to be a bump up and a dynamic. And we have all the things put together. So let's try it. So let's do what we did last time. Let's do the slurring, legato, and then staccato with this new dynamic, just to kind of ease into it. I'm all about, taking previous things and working into the next level. Okay, so here's slurring with the dynamics, 2. All right. Good. I need to get my water out here. It's a lot of forte playing. All right, legato. 1, 2. All right. All right, and now we're going to do our staccato. So what's going to happen here, what makes this kind of challenging, is that the louder we go, the more air we're pushing through. The tendency is to want to make these notes long, but you got to keep them short. You got to keep them super short, and that's the discipline of the staccato, is keeping the dynamic consistent, the articulation consistent, and not messing up the phrasing or any of the nicer, parts of the music. So let's try it, and of course keep our phrasing. Bum, 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 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1. Get that? 1, 2, ready? Good. Let's try once again. 1, 2, ready? was a lot of material. We covered, all these big four concepts and also the two articulation within the one realm. And we have a few moments for questions. Hope it wasn't too boring for you guys, but I hope you can see why this is so important to focus on, and then how this is kind of how the Coprash etudes are structured in many ways, along with a few other etude books. So, anybody have any questions?
We just got one in the chat here. Emily Hagee says, for legato tongue or slurring, do you ever experiment with fast fingers versus slow fingers? Which is better in terms of phrasing?
Ooh, well, normally I think fast. I mean, when we talk about fingerings, you're talking about the releasing of the valve and the opening of the valve chambers. So slower, unless you have a very leaky horn. For my Lawson here and my Rauk, the slow valves aren't going to work very well. They're going to just miss the note. If you're playing a Wiener horn, maybe, I don't know, but I tend to err on the fast, and you want to change, at the moment the note is happening. A great exercise for that, by the way, is the chromatics. We do that. We did a little bit of that today, and just making sure that each note, when you change the note, the finger goes down and you're not taking extra time, with it. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but I would err away from. Okay, yeah, I would err away from like slowing the valves down, because what you're doing is actually just not allowing the chambers to open. So, what are some, let's see, methods or concepts you suggest for finding one's own ideal tongue position for any given note? Well, that's a good question. I mean, a lot of it just comes down to the result you're getting. I mean, if you're trying a certain articulation like tu or ta, and you're not really able to achieve this kind of super separation with a good quality, you may have to experiment. You may have to move into a da or a do even. In very fast articulation, like Mozart, for instance, I rarely ever, use any sort of harsher consonants. It's always more of a da, that kind of quality. That's getting away from your question, but I just think so much of this and the difficulty of it is because of the differences between all of us and our physiology. We may have to do different things. Like I have a very fat tongue like that. Some people have very pointy tongues. So I have to do certain things with my articulation that someone with a very pointy tongue wouldn't have to do, and they might have to do vice versa for me. And so a lot of it's just listening and getting the result you want. And that's why I think these particular exercises are important, because they pinpoint this idea of what the concept is of what this sounds like. When you're doing a molto legatissimo, this is what it needs to sound like. It needs to be the notes blending from one to the next. When you do a molto staccatissimo, it needs to be this hyper separation with integrity of sound. If neither of those are achieved, even though you're doing the correct articulation, I think you just need to do more investigation and experimenting. I don't have a better answer than that.
Do you actually, question from me, do you ever deal with Kendall, the specific methods that he did with his staccato, with the specific procedures he implemented?
Like more like the lower
With the compression.
I don't, because I don't think I think it worked for some people. I think it worked for him, but I think for me, it doesn't really. I actually got into some issues with that, with my playing, with some holding in of my air sometimes, and also kind of hyper compressing my air, leading to some Valsalva maneuver things. He didn't deal with that, and that's why I say like everybody's different. So what worked for him? So I would just say, if that works for you, try it. I mean, even more extreme, or kind of get the tongue between the teeth or something like that. I mean, if that really works for you and you feel comfortable and it's not causing tension, by all means. I mean, there's really no rules. We're just kind of going for the result in some ways. But I have just found that personally to not work for me, and it often, I have not found it working for my students very often either. So,
Any other questions from the peanut gallery? We've got just a couple minutes left. Here's another one from Emily Hagee. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right. In the staccato exercise, do you recommend relaxing and resetting the face in between articulating the notes or holding the embouchure?
Well, I assume you're talking about like consecutive notes, because obviously with big rests, you could relax if you wanted to. Um, I would say you should be pretty set. I mean, you don't want to be moving, your setup at all. I mean, if anything, this idea of support, this air support behind the notes, that's going to be the ultimate thing that achieves that kind of quality. And in order for that to happen, I mean, you need to be pretty firm. Your embouchure needs to be set. It's a lot of force actually. If you articulate, especially very fortissimo and very staccato, I mean, there is a lot of incredible force behind that we have to learn to um, deal with as players. I remember when I was a kid, I used to turn bright red when I would try to play very loud and staccato because I had too much back pressure and I wasn't quite um, calibrated, if you will, as efficient, to be as efficient as I needed to be. Um, so I think I definitely wouldn't relax. I don't think there's much time for relaxing. That would actually probably create more tension. I think in the end, with a question like that, I might have to hear you in terms of what you mean by relaxing, though, because I may not be understanding your question quite as well. So, okay, I answered your question. So, yeah, it's hard when we're doing it over Zoom. I think everything's conceptual.
Right, right. Well,
Good
and
question.
I just want to one more comment from me. I've been going to KBHC since '99, so a couple of years. In fact, this is a 2000 shirt.
Yeah.
It's probably older than most of the people online here. The one thing I would say that made a big difference in me was the fundamentals more than learning all of the solos, learning everything else. It really boiled down to the fundamentals that took me up to the point of being able to actually win auditions.
Well, yeah, I agree, and myself as well. It's like there's a reason why they're called the fundamentals because they apply to everything. So yes, you will still have to, conceptualize your orchestral excerpts. You still have to listen to, music with scores, and you'll still have to do all of these things and learn your parts. But if you have these more rudimentary um, skills in place, and they're very firmly in place, I've just found it frees your playing immeasurably, and always also gives you very, very specific reference points to focus on when you do have, certain difficulties, or when you do face music that might seem insurmountable, but then you realize, oh, you break it down, with this kind of thing. So I'm glad you said that, because I feel I've always felt it was the strongest, or maybe the core of the camp, if you will, for that very reason.
One of the most important aspects. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, it's the idea of like, with as players, we're building. It's like, so we're building a building. We're an architect. We're designing a building. Sometimes it's very easy. Well, I got to do that pool in the penthouse, man. I got to get that, hot tub and the air conditioning. You want all these parts of the building. Of course, that's what we see. But underneath all that's this foundation. So if you don't have that, if you don't have this firmly, granite grounding with all the steel beams and all these things, all that extra stuff, it might seem great. It might be kind of interesting to work on, but you might build it up for a while, but then it crashes down,
Well, but
So
have you ever done the marshmallow test?
no, what's that?
You'll have to Google that sometime. It's a team building business thing. It take too long to explain, but that's exactly what
Sounds,
we're talking about.
I'm just thinking about like, what is that with Chubby Bunny, that game where you stuff marshmallows in your mouth, but that's not
Yeah,
it.
no, this is you use marshmallows and toothpicks to build a structure, and
Oh, I should. That sounds very. I want you to tell me about that later,
yeah,
because
yeah.
that's
We'll talk. We ran out of time, but I'll tell you about
okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming to the session. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see everybody tonight as we introduce our faculty and everybody. So,
it. All right. Thanks everybody for coming today. So thanks for attending the session for 2021 online KBHC experience, an offering of Cormont music and our gift to the Horn community. Please join us at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time tonight for our first evening session, KBHC Welcome and Introduction. In the meantime, please check us out on our various social media platforms. You can subscribe to us on YouTube by searching for Kendall Betts Horn Camp. You can also find us on Facebook using @KB Horn Camp and Instagram using @official_KBHC. Anytime you post about us or share something we posted, be sure to include the hashtag KBHC 2021. And I've heard there's been quite a few posts like that already. Finally, please visit us at horncamp.org for more information about our upcoming online and hopefully in-person offerings. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.